In this presentation, I'll be talking about the theme gender in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. This is useful if you get a question on gender, or if you get a question on masculinity, you could focus on the first half of this video because I'll be talking about the presentation of men. Or if you get a question specifically focusing on the female characters, then please focus on the latter half of this presentation because that focuses on the women in the play. So first of all, if you get a question based on gender in some way, I think it's really important to initially highlight your understanding of Verona as a society, and that it is a patriarchal society, and therefore women and men have very defined roles or defined expectations. Men are expected to have a driving need to prove their power over others, whether that be over women or other men. And we see that in Mercutio, in Tybalt, Samson, and Lord Capulet and Lord Montague. Women are expected to submit to the status quo, that being that men are in control in this society. Whether they be a daughter, a wife, or an employee, they should accept that they are under a man's control. What's interesting, and of course we see, I should mention that the nurse and Lady Capulet are good examples of that. I would use Romeo and Juliet as characters that defy those stereotypes. They really challenge their gender or their supposed gender roles, and really go quite the opposite. And obviously that ends in tragedy, which we will talk about later. Before we talk about the presentation of men in this play, it's important to understand the society in which Shakespeare was writing in, that being the Elizabethan era. So here are some things to take into consideration, and it might explain the actions or the values of some of the characters. So for instance, fights made up the majority of violent deaths during the Elizabethan time. 90% of homicides had a male defendant and 80% had a male victim. So what we're seeing here is male on male crime being very high. So men were expected to be violent in order to defend their honour. It was an expectation of them to really prove their masculinity. Dueling was very much seen as part of defending your honour. Especially if you were noble, you had to constantly protect your honour and your family's honour. And so we see that, of course, with the feud between the families, between Montague and Capulet. One way to lose your honour was to be a coward, and I'm sure immediately we're thinking about that fight scene between Romeo and Tybalt. So the best way to avoid being considered a coward was to outwardly challenge others, and you see that in Tybalt. Male friendship also, and I must mention that I don't really talk about male friendship in this video. You could look at my video on Mercutio, which goes into a bit more detail, but something to consider here as well, that male friendship constituted a brotherhood of a spiritual kind that involved notions of service and sacrifice, frequently death. In comparison, the love of a woman was considered sexual and therefore inferior to the love between male friends. So really, male friends were really held in much higher esteem than a man would hold his wife, potentially. So that's something to take into consideration when we think about Mercutio fighting on behalf of his friend Romeo. So let's look at some of these stereotypes. I'm going to take this step by step. I'm going to look at a male stereotype and then talk about how Romeo challenges that stereotype. So if we look at the quote, ancient grudge, the audience does not know the root of the feud between the families. We're only ever told that it's a really old grudge. The original reason is no longer what fuels it. So we learn really what really fuels this grudge between the two families is male pride, because we only ever see the male members of the cast, or the male characters if you like, upholding this feud, and they never go into detail about why they actually hate each other. So it's male pride that gives the feud longevity, and of course we're starting to understand that masculinity is all about defending one's honour, isn't it? And that's what happens. This is the problem with having these ideas about masculinity. Look at Samson at the beginning of the play. We're thrown into violence when he says, "Draw if you be men." The imperative, that being draw, is antagonistic, and the conditional clause, if, suggests their masculinity depends on their willingness to fight. If you're men, then you should be drawing your swords right now and fighting. So by beginning the play with a fight, the audience learns that male violence will pervade this play, and you might even go as far to say that it's male violence that underlines the greatest problem in this society, and maybe even the biggest downfall for Romeo and Juliet. They live in this unjust, violent society where their love can't survive. And then look at Tybalt in Act 1, Scene 5. This is after he has seen Romeo gate crash the party, and he's extremely angry and wants to fight, but Lord Capulet stops him too. But he says, "This intrusion shall now, seeming sweet, convert to bitter gall." So the feud has made Tybalt territorial and vengeful. He has become a symbol of the family grudge. As the families have held this ancient grudge, so does Tybalt have a tendency for vindictiveness. So it seems to be this male trait, holding on to these grudges, being extremely stubborn, not backing down. His hatred is deep like bile in the gallbladder. He is living proof of the relentlessness of a grudge, emphasising that this feud can only end with the tragic loss of Romeo and Juliet. So this helps build tension for the play, and the audience feel unsettled knowing Tybalt's hatred towards Romeo, and foreshadows that he will play a part in Romeo and Juliet's downfall. So you might even argue from this, whenever we see men on the stage, as a member of the audience, we feel unsettled because we've already seen that typically the male characters are very antagonistic, they're very violent. So it's inevitable, if there's lots of men on the stage, that a fight is going to happen. And maybe Shakespeare wrote this play to highlight these problems with these ideas of masculinity and these pressures put on the men to uphold their honour through violence. But Romeo challenges that stereotype of being aggressive and violent. Look at the way we first hear of him, and that's through his own father describing him to Benvolio and the way he's been behaving. He says he's away from light, shuts up his windows, makes himself an artificial night. So really here Shakespeare is parodying the Petrarchan lover, and that is that stereotypical lover who loves someone but it's unrequited, they don't love them back, and they're extremely melodramatic, moping around, crying, feeling sorry for themselves, exaggerating their feelings. That's Romeo. So Shakespeare here, you might argue, isn't really being sensitive towards Romeo but actually poking fun at him, hence why you see his friends like Mercutio and Benvolio laugh at him as well. And then look at when we meet Romeo again in the same scene. Love is a smoke raised with the fume of sighs. His poetic language juxtaposes Romeo to the aggressive and vulgar language of the men at the beginning of the scene. And this contrast serves to effeminize him, because we've just established at the beginning of the play that the men believe if they are men, they will fight. And then straight away we're juxtaposed with this moping Romeo who's talking lots and lots about his feelings, and in a very melodramatic way. And of course, look at the way Mercutio views Romeo when he backs down from a fight with Tybalt. He says vile submission. His disgust in Romeo's passiveness is clear in the adjective vile, and his exclamatory sentence, that's the use of the exclamation mark, really highlights and emphasises that level of disappointment in his friend. He clearly believes that a man's honour depends on his ability to meet violence with violence, and Romeo has failed to do that, and therefore he has lost his honour. Look at another male stereotype, that in the belief of power over women. You might argue this is a hegemonic patriarchy, okay, this idea of kind of control over others, especially women. Look at what Samson says right at the beginning of the play. It's established that women are lesser, or seen as lesser, than men. He says, women, being the weaker vessels, are ever thrust to the wall. Therefore I will thrust his maids to the wall. So it's really vulgar. The noun vessel depicts women almost like an empty object and of little worth. The comparative adjective weaker reveals how Samson establishes his own dominance by focusing on the weakness of women. So you might argue that for a man to feel masculine, to feel powerful, he must assert his control over those that are weaker than him. We've seen them do that over other men, but they also do it over women to make themselves feel powerful. The possessive pronoun his presents women as men's property and something to be overthrown as an assertion of power. The dialogue also normalises sexual violence because he's talking about thrusting them against the wall, so he's being really lewd here. And it reveals the extent Samson is willing to go to prove his male dominance. Would he really do that? We don't know. But he's saying it loudly and he's saying it proudly, and he thinks it's making him look much more masculine. And also think about the way it's received by those around him as well. It's normalised, the fact that he can say that out loud. Think about if you heard someone say that in front of you and how you would respond. I think we live in a different society now where we might react to someone speaking in this way. Look at the way Mercutio speaks of Rosaline in Act 2, Scene 1. He refers to her quivering thigh and the domain that there adjacent lie. Here he's focusing on her physical attributes, especially giving attention to her most intimate body parts, and this reduces women to sexual objects and therefore suggests that they are less important because they are not human beings, they are just objects, and that's the way he seems to refer to them. Again, Romeo challenges this perception of men by the way that he treats Juliet. Juliet is not a sexual object. Juliet is not lesser than him. If anything, Juliet is put on this pedestal. He worships her. Look at the religious language he uses in Act 1, Scene 5. He refers to her as a holy shrine, and he is the pilgrim. So the use of religious language places Juliet on a pedestal, depicting her as something sacred to be worshipped. This really juxtaposes with Samson's and Mercutio's depiction of women. Look at the balcony scene in Act 2, Scene 2, being over my head as a winged messenger of heaven. In other words, he's referring to her like she's an angel. This simile likens Juliet to an angel and therefore refers to her as his superior. It's also symbolised as well if you think about the stage directions where she is on a balcony and he is standing below her. So that also symbolises the hierarchy in this relationship. She is much more superior than he. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth I never will be Romeo. So in that same balcony scene, he's basically saying he's willing to give up his name and his identity to be with Juliet. This is a direct reversal of gender roles, when this is a time, and still is in many countries, many traditions, when a woman would be expected to give up her family name for her husband, but in this he's willing to do that for her. So again, we're seeing this challenge to the expectations of Romeo as being a man. Another male stereotype is to be in control of one's emotions. Now this is a little bit contradictory because they are expected to be hot-headed and to be very kind of reactionary when it comes to fighting, but in terms of emotions of love, they're supposed to think with their head and not their heart. We see this in Mercutio when he's speaking to Romeo, trying to make him feel better about being lovesick over Rosaline in Act 1, Scene 4. He says, prick love for pricking and you beat love down. Look at those violent verbs, okay? Prick and beat. That contrast to Romeo's poetic language of love that we've seen, that quite hyperbolic detail that he goes into, the way that love is for him. So this violent imagery depicts love much more like a battle, reinforcing the idea that men were not to succumb to the weaker emotions of love. Okay, love is a weak emotion. It's for women, not for men. We see this again with Mercutio in Act 3, Scene 1 when he's dying, okay? And he refers to his stab wound, which is going to kill him, as a scratch, and he even repeats it twice, a scratch, a scratch. Belittling something and making something seem less than it is called meiosis. So the use of meiosis really is Mercutio conforming to his masculine ideals, even to the very end, to the very last breath. He is trying to act like a man. I don't feel anything, this is just a scratch, when really he's bleeding to death. I'm sure he's feeling a lot of pain. Romeo challenges this. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He definitely displays a lot of emotion, especially emotion in terms of love. And he's aware of this as well. He says in Act 3, Scene 1, when he doesn't fight Tybalt to begin with, he says, "Thy beauty hath made me effeminate, and in my temper softened valour's steel." Romeo uses hyperbole to emphasise the great effect Juliet's beauty has. He now displays the more feminine quality of peacekeeper. So he's unable to have this fight with Tybalt, and he thinks it is Juliet's fault. She has made him less masculine. His metaphorical valour's steel suggests, as a man, his courage should be unwavering, yet Juliet's beauty is so powerful it can soften the strongest of metals. So that's really highlighting the power of love. The exclamatory sentence may reflect a sense of fear in Romeo that he has lost his courage and therefore his masculinity. We also see this in Friar Lawrence, a holy man, so this really highlights how deeply embedded these stereotypes are, and how even influential people in society upheld these views on how men should be. And when he says, "Art thou a man? Thy form cries out thou art, thy tears are womanish." So this is when Romeo is crying because he's just learnt that he's to be banished. And even the nurse says, "He is even in my mistress's case." So he is just as upset as Juliet. So when she finds him in this same scene, she says Romeo is just as upset as Juliet. So the rhetorical question from Friar Lawrence intends to incite a feeling of shame in Romeo for such an emotional display. Describing Romeo's tears as womanish suggests that such physical displays of emotion are considered feminine and therefore weak. The nurse draws a parallel between Romeo and Juliet's reaction, and actually what she's doing there, she's accusing Romeo of failing to handle the situation as a headstrong man should. So a man shouldn't respond to this circumstance the same way his wife does. He should be stronger. He shouldn't show any emotion, but Romeo does. Now we're going to move on to women and think about the way women were viewed and expected to behave in Elizabethan society. So in Elizabethan England, as we've already said, it was a patriarchal society. They were considered the lesser sex. This is even evident, even though Queen Elizabeth I, who was ruling at that time, of course she's a woman, she was questioned by many, especially at the beginning, on her ability to rule based on the fact that she was a woman. Also consider the fact that the marriage process, particularly for wealthier families, reduced women to commodities, okay? They were seen as a bargaining tool, if you like. Daughters of respectable families would expect their fathers to be very involved in choosing a husband for them. This highlights the belief at the time that girls were commodities and could be used in marriage to form useful alliances. They also led very sheltered lives, and we see this with Juliet as well. They typically stayed at home to learn domestic skills. They'd be homeschooled. They'd be allowed out to make confession, as we see Juliet does. But apart from that, they didn't really have much life experience. And of course, that really closed off any options for them to be anything else other than a wife, because that's all they were ever prepared for from a young age. The concept of adolescence as well was just non-existent for girls especially. The transition from childhood to adulthood was very abrupt, and that's why I'm sure many of you read Romeo and Juliet, was very surprised to hear them talk of marriage and learn that Juliet is only 13. Female desire as well, in any form, but especially physical, and here really we're talking sexual, was not recognised by the Elizabethan patriarchal society. Sharing one's desires as a female would be deemed improper. After all, A woman was expected to serve the needs of men. The needs of women was not important. The needs of men was, and it was a woman's role to provide for a man and his desires. So let's look at how we see that in female roles, or the way that they are treated. So first of all, look at the names of some of the characters: Lady Capulet, Lady Montague, and Nurse. This relationship of subordination and dependency renders women objects attached to their male subject, as seen in the names of some of the female characters. So married women are referred to as their husbands' wives, and working women are named after their profession and therefore their usefulness for men. So they don't really have an identity separate to the man in their life, whether that be their husband or their employer. And then look at how Lady Capulet speaks to Juliet in terms of marrying Paris. She says, by having him, making yourself no less. In other words, if you marry him, you will make yourself better in terms of a social status. So here she highlights how a woman's social status relied completely on their husband's status. There is no independent identity for Juliet. Her current status is attached to her father, and her marriage will see a swift transition from daughter to wife, and therefore her husband's social status becomes her own social status. But Juliet challenges this. She's much more independent. First of all, when we see Romeo and Juliet interact in Act 1, Scene 5, you'll notice that they share equal lines, and actually their lines form a sonnet. So it's very poetic, it's very beautiful, it's very romantic. But more than that, if we're talking about her challenging female stereotypes, it actually symbolises how they are each other's equals. They are equally matched in wit. We see this banter back and forth, and they've just got the same personality, haven't they? So we're seeing this equal relationship, much more at odds to what maybe was typically seen amongst wealthier families in the Elizabethan era. And then look at the balcony scene. Look how direct Juliet is with Romeo. If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage send me word tomorrow. In other words, if you're honourable, if you're honest about how much you love me, then tell me tomorrow if you'll marry me. That's how direct she is. So the conditional clause is if, okay? Challenges Romeo's motives. So she questions him. She doesn't just trust him, she's questioning how honest he is about his love. And the imperative send is direct, it's forceful, it's commanding. And so we're seeing a girl that's actually taking control of her own relationship and not depending on her parents as would be expected. Another female stereotype would be that they would be sexually subservient. And what we mean here is that, like I've said before, that they would cater to men's needs, and it wasn't about their own needs or desires. So this is really quite shocking. The nurse in Act 1, Scene 3 is recalling a joke that her husband said about Juliet when she fell over and she fell on her front, and she would have been about 2 years old, because she says that this was about 11 years ago and we know that Juliet is 13. And she says, thou wilt fall backward when thou comest to age. In other words, you'll learn to fall on your back. And she's being really lewd here, and her husband was at the time speaking to a 2-year-old, basically saying when you're older you'll learn to fall on your back, and in other words, please a man. So the nurse's lewd joke makes light of the subservience expected of women. The fact that this joke was originally told to Juliet at the age of 2 highlights the early objectification of girls and their assumed role of satisfying the needs of men. So from the very beginning they are seen as these objects that will later be used. And he's not saying that she would have been used at 2 to please any man, but later on in life that is her role, that she should please her man in that way. Mercutio also refers to women in this way. He says, making them women of good carriage. He reduces women to functions of sex and childbearing. Their worth is dependent on their service to men, whether that be to provide them with sex or to provide them with a child. But Juliet challenges this, and this is actually could be really quite shocking for an Elizabethan audience because she is sexually driven. Look at when she first meets Romeo and how flirtatious she is, she says, "Then have my lips the sin that they have took." In other words, kiss me again. He's already kissed her and she's telling him to kiss her again. That's incredibly direct. You have to think about the world that she lives in. This would be so improper. She should be courting Romeo. She should have an adult, probably her nurse, that would chaperone her. They would potentially be allowed to touch hands before they married. She might not even meet her husband before her wedding day. So this is incredibly forward. The imperative have is direct and again forceful, commanding. She knows what she wants. She is the antithesis of what was expected of a girl. A girl was expected to be coy and passive. We also see this in Act 3, Scene 2. She's waiting for Romeo to come back. Okay, they're married. She's waiting for them to consummate their marriage. In other words, for them to have sex and for her to lose her virginity. And she says, "Oh, I have bought the mansion of a love but not possessed it." This is part of a longer monologue, and this is quite an erotic monologue where she reveals that she's actually a sexually charged woman who seeks to make love for her own pleasure, not just to fulfill Romeo's needs. So she's looking forward to the pleasure it will bring her. Look at the language of possession. She talks about a mansion that she has bought and the fact that she hasn't possessed it yet, but she will, and she looks forward to possessing it. So this really challenges the perception of the sexually subordinate woman, where she would be possessed and she would be bought. In this case, she's flipped it and she's looking at Romeo much more in an objectified way. So she very much wants to be an active participant in her union with Romeo. She doesn't want to be passive. This would be very taboo in this Elizabethan time and potentially uncomfortable for members of the audience to watch, because they wouldn't believe a woman should be like this. And bearing in mind this is a monologue, so she talks at length about how much she looks forward to this night. So this is really, really against what would be expected of women, especially of her class. Let's look at another female stereotype, that of being powerless in society and powerless in their life, if you like, in the direction of their life. And we see this at the beginning from Juliet. She's incredibly subservient, incredibly dutiful to her parents when she says, "No more deep will I dart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly." And this, she's talking about Paris, basically saying, "I'll only like him as much as you want me to like him." So she's initially depicted as a stereotypical dutiful daughter who looks to her parents' wishes in determining who she marries. Look as well at Lord Capulet in the way he speaks to her later, Act 3, Scene 5, and he's actually speaking to his wife at this point because they've decided that they would like her to marry Paris and to do so in a few days' time. And he says, "Have you delivered to her our decree?" Decree connotes legal authority, and that emphasises the control Lord Capulet has over Juliet, which is very much in line with the type of control a father would have over his daughter. You might say this is dramatic irony, that being the audience understands the situation much more than Lord Capulet at this stage, because actually she's a married woman, and his control, once she's married, his control no longer exists, and it should be her husband Romeo who has control over her. So you might even call this dramatic irony. And look at the way he changes so quickly. Remember at the beginning of the play he says she's the hopeful lady of my earth, I worship her, and so on. As soon as she goes against his desires, because she basically says I will not marry, he says hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. The lexical field of suffering highlights the vulnerability of Juliet. Her welfare depends on her obedience to her father, and bear that in mind. The reason why women were so powerless in this society is because they couldn't make a living. They weren't educated. They'd only been prepared for a role as wife. So they were incredibly dependent on their fathers. And so typically they had no choice but to do what their fathers wanted. And then, of course, when they marry, the same amount of control would be transferred to their husbands. But Juliet challenges this. She has agency over her life. She declares, I will not marry yet, in Act 3, Scene 5. So she shows, that declarative sentence shows that she is unwavering against her father's demands. She's going to stick to what she wants. And at the end of that scene, when her father leaves, and what we've just seen is him basically say, well, you can die in the streets because I'm washing my hands of you. She says, if all else fails, myself have power to die. It's quite a paradoxical statement, but it reveals the patriarchal restraints on Juliet, and it confines her to limited options, but she is willing to take the option that she prefers. Her option is to marry Paris or to kill herself. She's going to choose to kill herself and defy her father's wishes. So she chooses to take control of her destiny in the limited way she can. And we see that right at the end when she refers to the instrument of her death as "O happy dagger" in Act 5, Scene 3. This is of course an oxymoron, but the interjection and exclamation express her heightened emotions and her willingness to die. That's her actively taking a decision about her life or the end of her life. Her suicide contrasts to Romeo as well. Remember, we've already talked about Romeo being really quite feminine. He takes poison. She is much more masculine in her death. It's much more aggressive because she stabs herself. So again, even in their death, they are challenging the stereotypes of their gender. And of course, what you'll always want to do in a response to a question is really think overall. If you want to get those higher marks, you'll want to think about the function of that theme, or why did Shakespeare include that theme, or want to draw attention to it. And I think there are two options here, and they're very different. And of course, you can mention both as options. You don't have to stick to one idea. You can explore alternatives. Is this play a commentary on unequal gendered power structures? Is Shakespeare saying, look, this is what's wrong in our society. Look what happened to two beautiful people who had this wonderful, romantic, one-of-a-kind relationship that couldn't survive in a society that wouldn't allow it, in a society that wouldn't allow Romeo to have emotions as deeply as he did, in a society where Juliet doesn't have the freedom to choose her own husband? Or is it a cautionary tale? Is Shakespeare actually saying, this is what happens when you reject your gendered roles? This is what happens when you're an outlier in society and you don't conform to the expectations. You die. So is he actually warning people to actually conform, to not go against the grain, as Romeo and Juliet did? And that's up for you to decide, but I certainly would have that in your answer, that you should be thinking about what was the purpose of having the theme of gender so strongly throughout the play. As always, I would love to hear your own ideas. Please leave a comment if you've got anything else to add. Like I said, I haven't looked at, in this video, brotherhood. And you could definitely look at Mercutio and Romeo for that. Check out my video on Mercutio for more details on that.